Usually when you hear the phrase diss track, there's this immediate expectation of a modern hip-hop feud, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You picture social media blowing up.
Exactly. You picture two artists trading these vicious insults over a heavy beat, airing out all this deeply personal, dirty laundry. And, I mean, the rest of us just grab some popcorn and watch the fallout in real time.
It feels very of the moment, very dependent on modern media to amplify that disrespect.
Right. It feels so intrinsically tied to our pop culture. But if you're gearing up for a literature exam or just insanely curious about the roots of modern satire, you are in the right place. Because when you step into the world of late 17th and 18th century English literature, that whole illusion that we invented the diss track just completely shattered.
It shatters into a million pieces.
Yeah. We are looking at a literary landscape that was honestly terrifyingly ruthless.
Yeah.
It was the absolute zenith of the intellectual takedown.
I mean, this was an era where a perfectly rhymed couplet could literally ruin a person's entire reputation. It could dry up their income and turn them into a walking punchline for, well, centuries.
It's the most literal historical manifestation of the pen being mightier than the sword. People weren't destroyed by physical violence here. They were destroyed by flawlessly executed poetry.
Exactly.
So today, our mission is a masterclass deep dive into the English Augustan Age. Specifically, we're going to unpack the age of John Dryden. So from 1660 to 1700, and then the era of Alexander Pope, spanning right up to his death in 1744.
And we really need to set some ground rules before we jump in.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Just a quick note before we dive into the deep end. The source materials we're looking at today deal with an incredibly polarized era. We're talking about bitter, often dangerous religious divides between Catholics and Protestants.
And intense political factionalism, too. The Whigs versus the Tories.
All right, Whigs and Tories. And we are looking at these feuds impartially, just as historical artifacts as they are presented in the texts. We aren't picking sides or endorsing any of the historical viewpoints or prejudices. We're just here to analyze the brilliant, brutal ways they fought each other on the page.
Because that factionalism is the engine of the literature. I mean, you can't understand the ferocity of the writing without understanding the life and death stakes of the political reality they were living in.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're talking about the birth of the common reader, the explosion of coffeehouse culture, and the ultimate literary diss tracks. But to truly grasp their impact, we have to start with the social and historical bedrock of the late 17th century.
Yeah, we have to look at a society rising literally out of the ashes.
You cannot separate the poetry of this era from the national trauma that came just before it. Before 1660, England had endured a bloody civil war and the shocking public execution of King Charles I.
Which is still just wild to think about.
It was unprecedented. Yeah. And that led to a strict military dictatorship under the Puritans, led by Oliver Cromwell. It was an era defined by extreme restriction.
Oh, yeah. The Puritans shut down the theaters, they outlawed public festivities, they even banned the celebration of Christmas, if you can believe it.
I mean, no Christmas. It was this highly religious, deeply austere holding pattern. But then in 1660, the dam breaks. We get the Restoration.
Right. King Charles II returns from exile in France. The monarchy, parliament, the law, they're all restored.
And the Merry Monarch, as Charles II was called, he presides over a court that was heavily influenced by French culture. Pleasure was suddenly like almost a patriotic duty again. The 20-year emergency of Puritan rule was finally over.
But that newfound stability was incredibly fragile, wasn't it?
So fragile, because almost immediately, the upper class fractures into two massive opposing political factions. On one side, you have the Whigs, who are generally aligned with the city, the growing merchant class, and the power of Parliament.
And on the other side, the Tories. They were aligned with the king, the traditional aristocratic court, and the Anglican Church.
Right. So that political instability is constantly humming in the background. But it was compounded by sheer, unimaginable physical devastation. The Restoration brought the king back, but nature seemed absolutely determined to wipe London off the map.
Yeah, in 1665, the Great Plague hits the city.
The mortality rates are staggering. We're talking about roughly 100,000 people dying in a single year. That was almost a quarter of London's population.
That is just, I mean, the psychological toll of that is profound.
You read accounts from people like Daniel Defoe. He wrote this masterly fictionalized but highly accurate chronicle called Journal of the Plague Year. And it paints this horrifying picture. The wealthy just fled the city.
leaving the poor trapped in their home.
Exactly, with red crosses painted on their doors, essentially left to be devoured by the disease. Defoe described people dropping in the streets as thick as leaves in autumn.
And just as the plague begins to subside, literally the very next year, on September 2nd, 1666, the Great Fire of London breaks out.
It starts in a simple baker's shop on Pudding Lane. And because the city was mostly built of tightly packed, dry timber houses, and there was this strong east wind blowing,
It just swept across the city unchecked for days.
yeah, we have diaries from men like Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn who watched it happen. Evelyn actually wrote that the sky was like the top of a burning oven. He genuinely thought it looked like the last day of the world.
The scale of the destruction is hard to fathom. The fire consumed 89 parish churches, 4 city gates, and around 13,000 houses.
The medieval heart of this city was completely vaporized.
Mm.
But, and this is crucial for the literature that follows, out of that absolute annihilation came a desperate national hunger for order and a massive opportunity for rebirth.
Which brings us to Christopher Wren, the architect tasked with rebuilding London. And Wren's philosophy is so central to the whole Augustan mindset.
Right, because for Wren, architecture wasn't just about putting roofs over people's heads. It was a deeply political and psychological tool. He believed that grand, symmetrical, rational public buildings establish a nation.
Yeah, they draw commerce and actively make people love their country. He rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral not just as a church, but as a towering monument to English resilience and order.
They were establishing this fierce national pride out of absolute ruin.
A fierce national pride built on order. I like that. And that order was further cemented by massive political and economic shifts later on, like the Glorious Revolution in 1688.
Right, where the Catholic King James II is deposed and the Protestant William of Orange and Mary take the throne. And it's called glorious because it was a largely bloodless transition. But its real significance is that it firmly placed the law and parliament above the king.
It fundamentally shifted the psychology of the English people. They finally felt legally secure. They weren't subject to the divine whim of a monarch anymore.
There were rules now. And alongside those rules came incredible wealth. International trade exploded. The East India Company is bringing in staggering amounts of exotic goods. Silk, porcelain, and most importantly, tea and coffee.
It's a fascinating paradox. While religion and politics were constantly dividing the nation, commerce and trade were stitching it back together.
Which birthed arguably my favorite social development of this era, the coffee house. In 1657, a Turkish merchant sets up the first coffee house in Lombard Street, and it catches on like wildfire.
By the early 1700s, there are thousands of them.
Thousands. You had specific houses for specific crowds. Willed Coffee House in Covent Garden becomes the legendary wit center.
Yeah.
John Dryden hung out there.
It was a profound social leveler. You didn't just have writers. You had politicians, theologians, and towering scientists like Isaac Newton all mingling in these smoke-filled rooms.
And the overarching culture of these spaces demanded one thing above all else: conversation. You could sit for hours for a penny dish of coffee, but engaging in sharp, articulate debate was practically mandatory.
It was a daily school of wit and dialectic.
I always compare these 17th century London coffee houses to the early days of the internet, like early Twitter or Reddit. It was this sudden democratization of debate.
That's a great analogy.
Right, you didn't have to be high aristocracy to have a voice. You just needed a sharp mind and a thick skin.
Yeah.
If you wanted to stay relevant, you had to log on, so to speak. You had to show up to the coffee house.
And just like the internet spawned new digital media, coffee house culture birthed the first modern newspapers and periodicals, like The Tatler and The Spectator.
Run by brilliant essayists like Richard Steele and Joseph Addison, these were short essays designed specifically to be read and debated in the coffee houses.
Yeah.
Queen Anne supposedly had The Spectator delivered with her breakfast every morning.
So this entirely shifted the ecosystem of writing. Before this, writers depended on aristocratic patronage. You wrote a poem to flatter a lord hoping for a pension.
But suddenly, with a literate middle class and the booming periodical market, a brand new demographic is born: the common reader.
Exactly. The publisher steps in as the middleman. The writer is no longer just trying to impress a wealthy patron. They are trying to capture the attention of a broad, educated, secular audience.
So society is stabilizing, the middle class is reading, and everyone is heavily caffeinated. But it wasn't just how they interacted that changed. How they fundamentally thought about the universe experienced a massive intellectual earthquake.
We really need to unpack the scientific revolution here because it basically went to war with the traditional concept of poetry.
In 1662, under Charles II, the Royal Society is founded in London. This brings together the titans of early modern science, Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle.
And they championed a radically new philosophical approach, methodological skepticism.
And we should clarify, we aren't talking about modern cynicism like everything is a lie.
No, not at all. It was a shift in how humanity arrived at truth. For centuries, learning had been deductive. You started with a massive truth, like the Earth is the center of the universe, and forced your observations to fit it.
The Royal Society completely inverted that. They championed inductive reasoning. You start at the very bottom, observing highly specific physical facts. You run experiments. Their motto was nullius in verba, which translates to on the word of no one.
Don't take Aristotle's word for it. Don't take the king's word. Show me the data.
Prove it, which is the foundation of the modern scientific method. But this hyper-rational obsession had a very intense side effect on literature. It triggered the war on fancy.
Right. Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke started mapping the human mind using this scientific categorization. They created a rigid division between wit and judgment.
And their definitions are different from ours today. Hobbes argued that fancy, or wit, is the mind's ability to observe similarities between disparate things, to combine different ideas quickly.
Which is the exact definition of writing poetry.
Exactly, making metaphors. But then Hobbes defines judgment as the ability to observe differences, to separate things out and discern the literal truth. And the Royal Society elevated judgment far above fancy.
Locke basically said wit is just a parlor trick. It makes pleasant pictures to mislead you, while judgment finds cold, hard reality.
This leads directly to a massive decline in myth. Thomas Spratt, who wrote the first history of the Royal Society, publicly argued that poetry's old fairy tales were fundamentally deceitful.
He proclaimed that myths of fairies or ghosts had to be abandoned for the real philosophy of natural causes. Scientific method was prescribed like a medicine to cure the human mind of its romantic swelling.
Which brings up a fascinating literary concept. T.S. Eliot looked at this shift and coined the phrase, the dissociation of sensibility.
Yes, that fatal split in the English psyche.
Yeah.
The intellect and the emotions parted ways. You could think rationally or feel deeply, but not both at the same time anymore.
As a result, poetry became highly rational, socially focused, and sharp, rather than mystical. The soul of poetry was traded for the intellect of poetry.
And Alexander Pope viewed the scientific awakening as a miracle. He even wrote an epitaph for Newton. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, let Newton be, and all was light.
But then, William Blake, a romantic poet a few generations later, looked back at this era with horror. He prayed to be kept from single vision and Newton's sleep. What Pope called light, Blake called sleep.
Blake felt that breaking the universe down into mechanical parts killed the spiritual vision of humanity.
Did science kill the soul of poetry, or just force it to grow up and deal with the real world? The Augustan writers were focusing on would fiercely argue the latter. They wanted an art form that matched their new, orderly worldview.
And this desire for order birthed the Neoclassical rules. This is why we call it the Augustan Age, right? It's a deliberate parallel to the Roman Emperor Augustus.
Right, because Rome emerged from civil war into profound peace and a flourishing of literature under Virgil and Horace. The English writers saw themselves as the new Rome.
And they borrowed heavily from French writers like Corneille and Boileau, who established strict rules. They believed literature was a craft with mathematical boundaries.
But they didn't see these rules as cages. Pope famously defended them by saying, those rules of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized.
Nature methodized. It perfectly aligns with the scientific revolution. They genuinely believed the ancients had discovered the mathematical laws of human aesthetics, just like Newton discovered gravity.
So imitating the ancients wasn't plagiarism. It was aligning your art with the absolute truth of the universe. And how did this manifest in the poetry? They rejected the soaring blank verse of Shakespeare and Milton.
Blank verse felt too chaotic. They wanted control, and they found it in the heroic couplet.
The heroic couplet is a very specific architecture. 2 rhymed lines of iambic pentameter, 10 syllables, unstressed, stressed rhythm, dot-dum, 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 dot.
But the genius is the balance. It heavily utilizes antithesis, placing contrasting ideas right next to each other, perfectly balanced on a pivot in the middle of the line.
It's a closed, symmetrical system of thought. The exact literary equivalent of Christopher Wren's rebuilt London. Clean, robust, rational. Dr. Samuel Johnson later praised it, though Romantic critics despised it as mechanical.
But in the hands of a master, the heroic couplet was a deadly weapon. It provided the perfect setup and punchline structure for satire. Which brings us to John Dryden.
The Camellia Laureate himself. Dryden is fascinating because his life maps onto the contradictory shifts of his age. He wrote an elegy praising Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan dictator.
But literally a few years later, he publishes poems celebrating Charles II's return, and later, under James II, he suddenly converts to Catholicism.
Was this guy just a massive opportunist, a sellout shifting with the winds to keep his government pension? Or just a pragmatist trying to survive an age where the wrong opinion could literally get you hung, drawn, and quartered?
Dr. Johnson forgivingly said Dryden simply changed with the nation. But his adaptability made him a survivor and the absolute center of English letters. He was poet laureate.
And so prolific. He churned out comedies even though he aided them, because that's what paid. He also experimented heavily with heroic drama.
These were wild plays, written entirely in rhymed verse, featuring superhuman heroes ranting about love and honor. Like Tyrannic Love, where the hero defies the gods on stage, pure melodrama.
And he wrote the critical essays to justify them. Dr. Johnson called him the father of English criticism. In his essay of dramatic poesy, Dryden rationally defended English tragicomedy against strict French unities.
But those over-the-top plays made him a massive target. In 1672, a satirical play called The Rehearsal was staged by the Duke of Buckingham. It viciously mocked Dryden as a pompous character named Bayes.
The actor even mimicked Dryden's voice and his habit of taking snuff. It humiliated him. But in a beautiful twist, this humiliation pushed Dryden to discover his true superpower.
He had an epiphany. If you take that magnificent Roman-style heroic language and apply it to something incredibly low and ridiculous, the contrast creates a devastatingly funny form of mockery.
He discovered the mock-heroic satire. Which brings us to his masterpiece, Mac Flecknoe, the ultimate founding mock-heroic diss track. The context is so petty, it's brilliant.
The background involves Thomas Shadwell, a fellow playwright, formerly a friend of Dryden's, but they became bitter rivals. Shadwell was a Whig, Dryden a Tory.
Shadwell had insulted Dryden in print several times. So in 1682, Dryden retaliates with Mac Flecknoe. The premise is amazing. There was a real, recently deceased, terrible Irish poet named Richard Flecknoe.
Dryden imagines that Flecknoe is the divine monarch of the realms of nonsense. But he's getting old and needs to choose a successor.
And out of all his sons in bad writing, he chooses Thomas Shadwell as the only man truly stupid enough to take the crown. Mac means son of, so Shadwell is Mac Flecknoe.
The opening lines sound incredibly serious. All human things are subject to decay, and when fate summons, monarchs must obey.
It sounds like the opening of a profound tragedy about Julius Caesar, but a few lines later, Flecknoe declares Shadwell is chosen because he alone stands confirmed in full stupidity.
That whiplash is the essence of the mock-heroic form. Dryden deliberately uses the register of royalty. Words like empire, majesty, sacred. He makes analogies to Augustus and Romulus.
But applies all of it to a fat, drunken hack writer. Let's break down the textual details. Where is this coronation? Not in Westminster Abbey. It's in the nursery, an actual training school for bad amateur actors near the Barbican.
And the physical items of the coronation. Instead of a sacred orb and scepter, Shadwell's sacred unction is a mug of ale, because he loved drinking at the tavern.
And he holds a scroll of his own terrible plays. When Romulus founded Rome, he saw 12 vultures as a divine sign. At Shadwell's coronation, 12 owls fly over the crowd. Owls symbolize dullness and ignorance.
Dryden uses bathos perfectly here, building up this majestic expectation, and then someone slips on a banana peel.
The ending of Mac Flecknoe is the ultimate bathos. King Flecknoe is delivering this grand prophetic speech to Shadwell. Trust nature. Do not labor to be dull. You don't even have to try to be stupid. But right in the middle of this speech, Flecknoe suddenly falls through a stage trapdoor.
It's just like a cheap slapstick trick in a bad play. And as he falls, his prophet's robe blows upward and lands squarely on Shadwell's shoulders, leaving him with double his father's stupidity.
It's so cinematic. But the mechanics of this attack are devastating. By using the register of royalty to describe a hack, Dryden is actively protecting the sacredness of true literature.
Bad writing wasn't just annoying to him, it was a genuine threat to the cultural order, a war with wit. By turning Shadwell into this mythical king of dullness, Dryden locks him in a cage of perfect poetry forever.
History only remembers Shadwell as Mac Flecknoe, the punchline. Dryden proved satire could be highly structured, immortal poetry, and he had incredible range, like his lyric ode Alexander's Feast.
But his satirical edge paved the way for the next generation, which brings us to Alexander Pope. Fast forward to the early 18th century, the Hanoverian kings are in power. The Whig Party is dominant under Prime Minister Robert Walpole.
And a new, deeply marginalized genius takes the stage. Alexander Pope was born in 1688, the exact year of the Glorious Revolution. But his life was defined by severe restrictions. He was a Roman Catholic in an intensely Protestant England.
The legal restrictions were crippling. He couldn't vote, couldn't attend a university, couldn't hold public office. He wasn't even allowed to live within 10 miles of central London.
And physically, he suffered terribly. As a child, he contracted tuberculosis of the bone, Pott's disease. It left him permanently deformed, with a severe hunchback, and stunted his growth to 4 feet 6 inches tall.
He was incredibly frail, plagued by constant pain and asthma. He heartbreakingly called his life a long disease. Plus, he was the son of a retired linen merchant, so he lacked aristocratic pedigree.
He was completely vulnerable in every sense, but he possessed this terrifyingly razor-sharp mind and an absolute mastery of the heroic couplet. He couldn't fight with a sword, so he fought with poetry.
And he became astonishingly successful. He was the first English writer to achieve massive financial independence solely through writing, mostly from his translations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey.
He sold them by subscription and made a fortune. This allowed him to buy a leased estate in Twickenham. And because Catholics faced restrictions on owning land, he leased it. It was bisected by a public road.
So, to connect his house to his gardens without facing harassment from passersby, Pope built a famous underground grotto.
Decorated with crystals and mirrors, it was his personal sanctuary. I always compare it to a modern celebrity's fortified compound. He's literally barricading himself from a world of desperate hack writers.
But he wasn't entirely isolated. He formed the famous Scriblerus Club with brilliant conservative minds like Jonathan Swift, John Arbuthnot, and John Gay.
They were dedicated to mocking pedantry and dullness. They saw the commercialized literary marketplace as a tidal wave of bad writing threatening true culture.
And it is out of this deeply defensive environment that Pope writes his absolute masterpiece, an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, published in 1735.
This poem is a masterclass in tone. It's a desperate apologia, a moral self-defense, and a vicious counterattack all at once. It's an epistle, a formal public letter in verse, addressed to his close friend, the physician, Dr. John Arbuthnot, who was mortally ill at the time.
Arbuthnot's presence is a brilliant dramatic device. The poem operates as a dialogue. Pope is venting, and Arbuthnot periodically interrupts as the voice of caution. Hold, for God's sake you'll offend. No names be calm. Learn prudence of a friend.
This allows Pope to present himself as a reasonable man who is listening to good advice, but the offenses are so egregious he simply must speak out. And he starts the poem right in the middle of a panic attack. Shut the door, good John. Fatigued, I said. Tie up the knocker, say I'm sick, I'm dead.
He's portraying himself as under siege in his Twickenham compound. The walls are being breached by hacks who want him to read their terrible manuscripts or lend them money.
This highlights the deep economic leitmotif of the poem. We're dealing with the harsh reality of Grub Street, where impoverished writers churned out cheap pamphlets just to survive.
Pope details places like the Mint, a designated sanctuary for insolvent debtors. He says they emerge on Sundays when they can't be arrested and swarm his house. Happy to catch me, just at dinner time.
Because they're literally starving. Pope maps out a 3-tier literary economy. The wealthy patrons at the top, the independent artist, which is him in the middle, and the starving hacks at the bottom, writing purely for bread.
He draws this contrast to make it clear he is not one of them. He claims he didn't write for money or malice. He lisped in numbers, for the numbers came. Poetry was a divine calling for him since childhood.
He constructs a deeply sympathetic portrait of himself as a dutiful son who cared for his aged mother, a loyal friend, and a patient man who endured vile slander about his body and religion for years in silence.
Which brings up the distinction between Horatian and Juvenalian satire. Horace wrote urbane, witty satire to gently correct society. Juvenal wrote savage, bitter outrage to destroy targets.
Throughout the poem, Pope claims he is being Horatian, just swatting away flies. But his specific portraits of his enemies are some of the most vicious Juvenalian attacks ever printed.
Pope's masterpieces of malice. The 3 most famous portraits are Atticus, Buffo, and Sporus.
Let's break down Atticus. This was a thinly veiled portrait of Joseph Addison. Addison was a tremendously famous writer, the force behind The Spectator. Pope doesn't just call him stupid because nobody would believe that.
Right, a crude insult is easily dismissed. Pope begins by acknowledging Addison's undeniable genius, calling him a man blessed with each talent. But then he exposes his fatal flaw, intense jealousy.
Pope portrays Addison as an autocrat who can't stand the idea of a younger rival sharing the spotlight. The couplets are incredibly sharp. He says Atticus will damn with faint praise, assent with civil leer, and without sneering, teach the rest to sneer.
Damn with faint praise, we still use that today. Pope paints him as a coward who subtly undermines you behind your back, sitting in his coffeehouse circle like a sultan, eliminating rivals.
It's a masterful, condescending mix of pity and destruction. Then we have Buffo, representing Charles Montague, the Earl of Halifax. Buffo is the vain, corrupt patron.
He shows how aristocratic patronage is intellectually bankrupt. Buffo doesn't care about good art, he just wants his ego fed by untalented hacks who flatter him for a meal.
Pope points out the grotesque hypocrisy. When true poets like Dryden or Gay were alive and starving, Buffo ignored them. But the second they died, Buffo paid for grand funerals and monuments just to carve his own name onto their tombs.
Pope writes that Buffo helped to bury whom he helped to starve. It's a scathing indictment of the wealthy elite pretending to care about the arts.
But nothing prepares the reader for the final portrait. Sporus. Sporus is Lord Hervey, a powerful courtier allied with the Prime Minister and the King. Hervey had co-written a vicious poem mocking Pope's deformities and obscure birth.
Pope's retaliation is arguably the most savage character assassination in English poetry. Arbuthnot actually tries to stop Pope in the poem, saying Hervey is just a bug, a painted child of dirt that stinks and stings.
But Pope refuses to stop. He attacks Hervey's politics, appearance, and his bisexuality. He takes the word bug and amplifies it. He calls Sporus a bug with gilded wings, a white curd of ass's milk.
He uses relentless animal imagery. He calls him a familiar toad sitting at the ear of Eve, whispering poison. His wit all seesaw, between that and this, now high, now low, now master up, now miss, and he himself one vile amphibian.
He strips Hervey of his humanity entirely, reducing him to a venomous pest infecting the royal court. But this forces a really complex question. Pope claims to be a moral Christian man just defending his quiet life. Is this attack on Sporus so deeply venomous and homophobic that it shatters Pope's moral high ground?
It's the central tension of Pope's work. Even Dr. Johnson felt the portrait of Sporus was uncomfortably mean. But for Pope, bad writing and bad morals were a literal spreading disease infecting the cultural body of England.
So squashing a bug like Sporus wasn't petty malice. To Pope, it was an act of public hygiene.
Public hygiene, exactly. He believed he was defending virtue itself from an army of darkness. He was the immune system of the English language.
Wow. Let's take a breath and zoom out to look at the incredible journey we've just taken through the Augustan Age. We started in the trauma of the Great Fire and the Restoration.
We explored how the Royal Society's scientific revolution rewired the English brain, making poetry rational and deeply suspicious of myth.
We saw that desire for order manifest mathematically in the neoclassical rules and the heroic couplet. We watched Dryden invent the mock-heroic form in Macflecknoe, using epic language to destroy a rival.
And finally, we descended into Pope's Twickenham fortress, seeing how he weaponized the personal epistle to defend his life and obliterate his enemies with surgical precision.
It's a phenomenal arc. You can see how the mix of coffeehouse culture, shifting patronage, scientific skepticism, and political factionalism forged these brilliant, ruthless minds. They were trying to write the rules for a modern society in real time.
And we made sure to cover everything thoroughly so anyone studying for an exam has all the critical context they need.
Exactly. And then that leads me to a final provocative thought I want to leave with you, the listener. The writers of the 18th century relied heavily on the printing press to standardize a civic language.
Whether Whig or Tory, they were participating in a shared rational discourse, trying to unite the public sphere after a century of civil war. The printing press was the anchor.
But look at the world we are operating in today. We live in an era of hyper-fragmented digital media. We don't have a shared coffeehouse anymore. We have highly personalized algorithms and echo chambers.
Are we actively losing that shared civic language that Dryden and Pope fought so hard to establish?
Furthermore, in Dryden's time, the two cultures of science and poetry were just beginning to split. Today, are science and the humanities so completely divorced that a modern Dryden or Pope couldn't even exist?
It's a terrifying question. If a modern genius wrote a perfectly balanced satirical poem today, would it even spark a national debate? Or would it just be swallowed by a niche algorithmic feed and forgotten by tomorrow?
It's something to deeply consider the next time you're scrolling through an endless comment section or watching the fallout of today's fleeting internet diss tracks. We might just be missing the shared linguistic architecture that gives the ultimate takedown its lasting, immortal power. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the brilliant, brutal world of the Augustan Age. Stay curious, keep reading, and we'll catch you next time.